What makes a king truly legendary? And why do we still speak of certain rulers centuries after their deaths? England, in the 14th century, became famous throughout the world for its warrior kings, its magnificent castles, and its longbowmen who could darken the sky with arrows. This was an age of chivalry, of knights in shining armour, of grand tournaments, where nobles jousted for honour and glory. It was also an age of terrible plague, of endless warfare, and of political intrigue that would shape the destiny of nations. At the centre of this remarkable era stood one man whose reign would last for 50 years and transform England from a troubled island kingdom into a dominant European power. His name was Edward, the third of that name to sit upon the English throne, and his story is one of ambition, triumph, tragedy, and enduring legacy. To truly understand Edward III, we must first understand the world into which he was born and the kingdom he would one day inherit. England, in the early 14th century, was a land of stark contrasts, of great wealth existing alongside grinding poverty, of magnificent cathedrals rising above humble villages, and of a feudal system that bound every person to their place in the great chain of being. The population of England at this time numbered somewhere between 4 and 6 million souls. Most of these people lived in small villages scattered across the countryside, working the land as their ancestors had done for generations beyond counting. They grew wheat and barley, raised sheep and cattle, and lived lives governed by the changing seasons and the demands of their lords. The average peasant rarely travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace, and the wider world remained a distant mystery known only through travellers' tales and the pronouncements of the local priest. The great cities of England were small by modern standards, but bustled with activity and commerce. London, the largest and most important, held perhaps 80,000 inhabitants within and around its ancient walls. The city sprawled along the northern bank of the River Thames, its narrow streets crowded with merchants, craftsmen, beggars, and nobles. The Tower of London, that great fortress begun by William the Conqueror, dominated the eastern approach to the city, a constant reminder of royal power. Westminster, just upriver, housed the great abbey where kings were crowned and the palace where they held court. Other cities played important roles in the life of the kingdom. York in the north served as the second city of the realm, a centre of ecclesiastical power and northern commerce. Bristol in the west grew wealthy on trade with Ireland and the continent. Norwich and Lincoln, Exeter and Salisbury, each had their own character and importance in the complex web of medieval English society. The church stood as the single most powerful institution in medieval England, touching every aspect of life, from birth to death and beyond. Great cathedrals rose in every major city, their soaring spires reaching toward heaven, their stained glass windows telling the stories of Scripture to a largely illiterate population. Monasteries and abbeys dotted the countryside, centres of learning and charity, of agriculture and industry. The Archbishop of Canterbury ranked as the most important churchman in the realm, and bishops sat in the House of Lords alongside the great nobles, wielding both spiritual and temporal power. The feudal system organised society into a rigid hierarchy. At the top sat the king, God's anointed ruler, the fountain of justice and the source of all legitimate authority. Below him came the great nobles, the earls and barons who held vast estates and commanded the loyalty of hundreds or thousands of lesser men. These magnates owed military service to the crown and expected in return the right to govern their lands with considerable independence. Below the nobles came the knights, the backbone of the medieval military system, men who held smaller estates in exchange for providing armed service when called upon. And below them stretched the vast mass of common people, from prosperous merchants and skilled craftsmen down to the landless labourers who owned nothing but their ability to work. This was the England that Edward II inherited from his father in the summer of 1307, and it was an England already showing signs of the troubles to come. Edward I, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, had been a formidable king, a warrior and lawgiver who had conquered Wales, nearly conquered Scotland, and established English royal authority on firmer foundations than ever before. But his wars had been expensive, and he left his son a kingdom burdened with debt and committed to military campaigns that would prove far more difficult than anyone anticipated. Edward II was everything his father had not been. Where Edward I had been tall, commanding and martial, his son was more interested in rural pursuits and the company of favourites than in the business of kingship. The new king quickly earned the resentment of his nobles by showering lands and titles upon Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who had been his close companion since youth. The nature of the relationship between Edward and Gaveston has been debated by historians for centuries, but what mattered to contemporaries was the perception that an upstart foreigner had gained undue influence over the king. The reign of Edward II lurched from crisis to crisis. In 1314, the Scottish king Robert Bruce inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the English army at Bannockburn, effectively ending English hopes of conquering Scotland and establishing Bruce's kingdom as an independent power. The battle was a disaster of the First Order, with thousands of English knights and soldiers killed or captured, and the king himself barely escaping with his life. The prestige of the English crown, built up over generations, collapsed in a single terrible day. The nobles of England grew increasingly restive under Edward's rule. Gaveston was eventually captured and executed by a group of magnates in 1312, but the king soon found new favourites to promote and new ways to antagonise his subjects. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's own cousin and the most powerful noble in the realm, led opposition to royal policies throughout the 1310s and early 1320s. Civil war flickered and flared, with the king and his opponents manoeuvring for advantage, occasionally clashing in open battle, and never reaching a stable settlement. The situation grew even more complicated by the involvement of foreign powers. Edward II was married to Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. The marriage had been arranged to cement peace between England and France, and to resolve long-standing disputes over the English king's holdings in Gascony, that wine-rich region in southwestern France, that English kings had held since the days of Eleanor of Aquitaine. But Isabella found herself increasingly marginalised at the English court, pushed aside by her husband's favourites, and denied the influence that a queen might reasonably expect. The situation reached its breaking point in the mid-1320s. Edward had by this time found a new favourite in Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man even more hated by the English nobility than Gaveston had been. The Despensers, father and son, accumulated lands and power with ruthless efficiency, crushing anyone who stood in their way. Isabella, sent to France on a diplomatic mission in 1325, refused to return. Instead, she gathered around her a group of English exiles and began planning an invasion. In 1326, Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, landed in England with a small army. The country rose against Edward II almost unanimously. The Despensers were captured and executed with particular cruelty. The king himself was taken prisoner and forced to abdicate in favour of his eldest son. Within a year, Edward II was dead, almost certainly murdered on the orders of Mortimer, though the exact circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery and controversy. This was the England into which Edward III was born, and the circumstances under which he came to the throne. He inherited a kingdom that had known nothing but misrule and civil strife for 2 decades, a kingdom humiliated by its enemies abroad and torn apart by faction at home. The treasury was empty, the nobility was divided, and the common people had lost faith in their rulers. Scotland remained unconquered and defiant. France loomed as a potential enemy, and the young king's own mother and her lover held the real power in the land. It would have been easy for such a king to fail, to become another in the long line of weak rulers who had plagued England since the death of Edward I. That Edward III not only survived these challenges, but transformed England into the dominant military power in Western Europe is a testament to his remarkable abilities and to the force of his personality. His story is one of the great tales of medieval history, and it begins in the troubled year of 1312. Edward of Windsor came into the world on the 13th day of November in the year 1312 at Windsor Castle, that great fortress overlooking the River Thames some 20 miles west of London. His birth was a moment of celebration in a reign that had known precious few such moments. Edward II finally had an heir, a son to carry on the Plantagenet line and inherit the throne of England. The baby was named Edward after his father and grandfather, continuing a tradition that stretched back through generations of English kings. He was the first child of Edward II and Isabella of France, and his arrival seemed to promise better days for a kingdom that had suffered through years of civil strife and military defeat. Bonfires were lit throughout London, church bells rang in celebration, and the nobility gathered to pay homage to the infant prince who would one day be their king. Windsor Castle, the place of Edward's birth, was already one of the most impressive royal residences in England. William the Conqueror had built the first fortification on this site shortly after his conquest, recognising the strategic importance of the location. Subsequent kings had expanded and improved the castle, adding towers and walls, chapels and great halls, until it had become a sprawling complex suitable for housing the royal court. The young prince would spend much of his childhood within these walls, and Windsor would remain close to his heart throughout his long life. The early years of Edward's life were spent in the care of nurses and tutors, as was customary for royal children of the period. His mother Isabella took an active interest in his upbringing, ensuring that he received the education appropriate for a future king. He learned to read and write in French, the language of the English court and nobility, and in Latin, the language of the church and of international diplomacy. He studied the Bible and the writings of the church fathers, the histories of ancient Rome, and the chronicles of his own ancestors. Physical training was equally important for a prince who would one day lead armies into battle. From an early age, Edward learned to ride horses, to handle weapons, and to conduct himself according to the elaborate codes of chivalric behaviour that governed the lives of medieval nobles. He practised with wooden swords before graduating to real blades, learned to couch a lance and charge at a target, and developed the strength and coordination that would serve him well in the wars to come. The household of the young prince was substantial, including knights and clerks, servants, and attendants of every description. Among the most important figures in his early life was his tutor Richard Berry, a learned clerk who would later become Bishop of Durham and one of the great book collectors of the medieval period. Berry instilled in his young charge a love of learning that would remain with Edward throughout his life, and the king would later become a notable patron of scholars and artists. But the young prince's childhood was shadowed by the troubles that beset his father's reign. He was only 2 years old when the disaster at Bannockburn shattered English power in Scotland, and he grew up hearing tales of that terrible defeat and the humiliations that followed. He witnessed the conflicts between his father and the English nobility, the rise and fall of royal favourites, and the growing tension within his own family as his parents' marriage deteriorated. Edward was given his own household at an early age, as was customary for heirs to the throne, and was created Earl of Chester in 1320 when he was just 7 years old. This title, traditionally held by the eldest son of the English king, came with substantial lands and revenues, and marked the young prince's formal entry into the world of English politics. He was also created Duke of Aquitaine, acknowledging his eventual inheritance of the English crown's French possessions. The young Edward showed early signs of the qualities that would later make him a successful king. Contemporaries noted his physical grace and his skill at martial exercises. He was tall for his age, fair-haired and handsome, with a natural dignity that impressed all who met him. He was also intelligent and observant, watching the events unfolding around him with a keen eye and learning lessons that would shape his later rule. In 1325, when Edward was 12 years old, his life changed dramatically. His mother Isabella was sent to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, over the status of Gascony. The negotiations were complex and difficult, touching on questions of feudal obligation and territorial sovereignty that had troubled Anglo-French relations for generations. Isabella succeeded in arranging a settlement, but the price was high. The young Edward was required to travel to France and pay homage to the French king for the Duchy of Aquitaine, a ceremony that acknowledged French overlordship over these English-held territories. Edward crossed the Channel in the autumn of 1325, accompanied by a substantial retinue of English nobles and officials. He performed the required homage to his uncle Charles, kneeling before the French king and placing his hands between those of his overlord in the ancient gesture of feudal submission. It was a humiliating ceremony for an English prince, a reminder that the kings of England held their French lands not by right of conquest, but as vassals of the French crown. But the homage ceremony was only the beginning of a much larger drama. Isabella, having accomplished her diplomatic mission, refused to return to England. She had grown to hate her husband and his favourites, particularly Hugh Despenser the Younger, who had displaced her at court and treated her with contempt. In France, surrounded by sympathetic relatives and freed from the constraints of the English court, Isabella began to plot her husband's overthrow. The young Edward found himself caught between his parents, a pawn in a deadly game of power politics. Isabella kept him with her in France, using his presence to legitimise her actions and to prevent Edward II from naming another heir. The king sent repeated demands for his son's return, but Isabella ignored them all. She was gathering allies, accumulating resources, and preparing for an invasion that would change the course of English history. Among the allies Isabella gathered was Roger Mortimer, an English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to France. Mortimer was a capable soldier and a ruthless politician, and he quickly became Isabella's closest advisor and, according to most accounts, her lover. Together they assembled a small army of English exiles and foreign mercenaries, funded in part by loans from French and Flemish bankers. In September of 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed on the coast of Suffolk with their invasion force. The young Edward, now 13 years old, accompanied them. Whatever his private feelings about the situation, he had no choice but to follow his mother's lead. He was too young to act independently, too closely guarded to escape, and too valuable as a symbol of legitimate succession to be left behind. The invasion succeeded beyond all expectations. Edward II had made too many enemies, and the country rose against him almost unanimously. The Despensers were captured and executed, their bodies mutilated in death as punishment for their crimes. The king himself fled westward, hoping to escape to Ireland or to rally support in Wales, but he was captured in November and brought back to face his fate. In January of 1327, a parliament met at Westminster to consider the future of the realm. Edward II was formally deposed, charged with a long list of crimes and failures, and forced to renounce his crown in favour of his son. The young Edward, just 14 years old, was proclaimed king. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of February, anointed with holy oil, and invested with the symbols of royal authority. Edward III had begun his reign. But the new king was a king in name only. Real power lay with his mother Isabella and her partner Roger Mortimer, who governed England in the young king's name. Edward was carefully supervised, his household controlled by Mortimer's supporters, his every action monitored and guided. He was allowed to participate in ceremonies and to issue documents in his own name, but the decisions were made by others. This period of tutelage would last for nearly 4 years, years in which the young king watched and learned and waited for his opportunity. He saw how Mortimer accumulated power and wealth, how he crushed opposition and eliminated rivals, how he manipulated the machinery of government for his own benefit. He saw his mother, once a proud queen, reduced to the status of Mortimer's partner and accomplice, and he saw his father, the anointed King of England, held prisoner in various castles until his death in September of 1327, almost certainly murdered on Mortimer's orders. These experiences shaped Edward profoundly. He learned the dangers of weak kingship and the importance of maintaining control over ambitious nobles. He learned the value of patience and the necessity of striking decisively when the moment was right, and he developed a burning determination to rule in his own right, to be a true king rather than a puppet dancing on strings held by others. The years of Mortimer's dominance were not entirely wasted, however. Edward continued his education, both formal and practical. He participated in tournaments and military exercises, honing the skills he would need as a warrior king. He observed the workings of government, learning how laws were made and enforced, how taxes were collected and spent, how diplomacy was conducted with foreign powers. He married Philippa of Hainaut in January of 1328, a match arranged by his mother as part of the alliance that had made the invasion possible. Philippa would prove to be one of the great blessings of Edward's life. She was a few years younger than her husband, kind-hearted and sensible, devoted to Edward and to the children they would have together. Unlike many royal marriages of the period, theirs was a genuine partnership, marked by affection and mutual respect. Philippa would bear Edward at least 13 children over the course of their marriage, and she would remain his trusted companion until her death more than 4 decades later. But in these early years of his reign, Edward had little time to enjoy domestic happiness. He was too busy watching Mortimer, waiting for the moment when he could break free of the regent's control and claim his rightful authority. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected, in a dramatic coup that would announce to England and to the world that a new king had truly arrived. The years between 1327 and 1330 were among the most frustrating of Edward's life. He was King of England, crowned and anointed, recognised by all as the legitimate ruler of the realm. Yet he could do nothing without the approval of Roger Mortimer, who controlled access to the king and dominated every aspect of government. It was a humiliating situation for a proud young man who had been raised to believe in his divine right to rule. Mortimer's power rested on several foundations. First and most importantly, he controlled the Queen Mother Isabella, whose support gave his regime a veneer of legitimacy. Isabella was the daughter of a king, the widow of a king, and the mother of a king, and her presence at Mortimer's side suggested that his government had royal sanction. Second, Mortimer controlled the military forces of the crown, having placed his own supporters in key positions throughout the kingdom. Third, he controlled access to the young king, ensuring that Edward could not build an independent power base or communicate freely with potential allies. The regime of Isabella and Mortimer was not without its accomplishments. They negotiated a peace treaty with Scotland in 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, which recognised Scottish independence and renounced English claims to overlordship. This treaty was deeply unpopular in England, seen as a shameful surrender of rights that Edward I had fought so hard to establish, but it did bring an end to decades of costly and inconclusive warfare. The treaty was sealed by the marriage of Edward's young sister Joan to David Brucey, the son and heir of King Robert II. Mortimer also worked to stabilise the government and restore order after the chaos of Edward II's final years. He suppressed a rebellion led by the Earl of Lancaster, executing the Earl's supporters and confiscating their lands. He reformed the administration of justice and attempted to improve the collection of royal revenues. In many ways, he governed competently, if ruthlessly. But Mortimer's greed and arrogance eventually proved his undoing. He accumulated titles and lands at an astonishing rate, making himself Earl of March and acquiring estates throughout England and Wales. He treated other nobles with contempt, dismissing their concerns and overriding their rights. He lived in royal style, maintaining a household that rivalled the king's own, and he conducted himself as if he were the true ruler of England, rather than merely the regent. The English nobility grew increasingly resentful of Mortimer's dominance. Many of them had supported Isabella's invasion in 1326, expecting to benefit from the change of regime, but they found themselves shut out of power and patronage by Mortimer's monopoly. They whispered among themselves, complaining of the regent's tyranny and wondering when the young king would assert his independence. Edward himself grew increasingly restive as he matured. By 1330, he was 17 years old, a married man with a child on the way, fully capable of ruling in his own right. Yet Mortimer showed no signs of relinquishing power, and Isabella seemed content to let her lover continue governing in her son's name. The king began to look for allies, carefully and quietly, knowing that any premature move could result in disaster. The situation came to a head in the autumn of 1330. A parliament was summoned to meet at Nottingham in October, and both the king and Mortimer travelled north to attend. The parliament was to address various matters of state, including ongoing disputes with France over Gascony and the continuing unrest in Ireland. But Edward had other plans. The young king had been in secret communication with a small group of trusted supporters, including William Montague, a young baron who had become Edward's closest friend and confidant. Together, they had developed a plan to seize Mortimer and end his dominance once and for all. The plan was dangerous, requiring precise timing and absolute secrecy, but Edward was determined to act. Nottingham Castle, where the court was lodged, was a formidable fortress, and Mortimer had taken care to control all the entrances and exits. His guards patrolled the walls and gates, and he kept the keys to the castle in his own possession. It seemed impossible to move against him without his knowledge. But the castle had a secret. A tunnel ran from the base of the rock on which the castle stood up into the heart of the fortress, a passage known only to a few. Edward learned of this tunnel from the castle's constable, who had been won over to the king's cause. On the night of October 19th, a small group of armed men, led by William Montague and guided by the constable, entered the tunnel and made their way up into the castle. The night of October 19th, 1330, was dark and moonless, perfect for the dangerous enterprise that Edward and his supporters had planned. The young king waited tensely in his chambers, knowing that his entire future depended on the success of the men making their way through the secret tunnel beneath Nottingham Castle. William Montague led the group of conspirators, perhaps 24 men in all, each one carefully chosen for his loyalty and his courage. They carried swords and torches, moving as quietly as possible through the narrow passage that wound upward through the rock. The tunnel was ancient, its origins lost in time, and the air within was stale and close. But the men pressed on, driven by their determination to free the king from Mortimer's control. The tunnel emerged within the castle walls, in a part of the fortress that Mortimer's guards did not patrol. The conspirators crept through the darkened corridors, heading toward the chamber where Mortimer was known to be sleeping. They encountered a few servants and minor officials, who were quickly subdued and bound before they could raise the alarm. Mortimer was in his chamber with Isabella when the conspirators burst through the door. The regent reached for his sword, but he was quickly overwhelmed by the armed men who surrounded him. Isabella, awakened by the commotion, cried out for her son to spare the gentle Mortimer, but her pleas went unheeded. The regent was seized, bound, and dragged away to await the king's justice. The coup was bloodless, or nearly so. A few of Mortimer's guards were killed in brief scuffles, but there was no general fighting. The castle garrison, seeing that the king himself had authorised the action, offered no resistance. By dawn, Edward was in complete control of Nottingham Castle, and through it of the Kingdom of England. The young king moved quickly to consolidate his position. Mortimer was taken to London under heavy guard and imprisoned in the Tower, the same fortress from which he had escaped just a few years earlier. A parliament was summoned to meet in November, and charges were prepared against the fallen regent. Isabella was treated more gently, confined to comfortable quarters, and provided with a generous allowance, but she was permanently excluded from political power. The Parliament that met at Westminster in November 1330 was eager to condemn Mortimer. The charges against him were numerous and serious. He was accused of assuming royal power without authority, of enriching himself at the crown's expense, of procuring the murder of Edward II, and of various other crimes and misdemeanours. He was not allowed to speak in his own defence, and the verdict was never in doubt. On November 29th, Roger Mortimer was drawn through the streets of London to Tyburn, the traditional place of execution for common criminals, and hanged until dead. With Mortimer's death, Edward III's personal rule truly began. He was 18 years old, energetic and ambitious, determined to restore the prestige of the English crown and to prove himself worthy of his grandfather's legacy. The challenges before him were immense. The treasury was depleted, the nobility was fractious, Scotland remained hostile, and relations with France were deteriorating. But Edward approached these challenges with confidence and optimism, qualities that would characterise his reign for decades to come. One of the new king's first priorities was to reward those who had helped him seize power. William Montague, the leader of the Nottingham conspiracy, was showered with lands and titles, eventually becoming Earl of Salisbury. Other conspirators received similar rewards, establishing a core of loyal supporters who would serve Edward faithfully for years to come. The king understood the importance of rewarding loyalty and punishing treachery, lessons he had learned during the dark years of Mortimer's dominance. Edward also moved to reconcile with those who had opposed him or who had supported Mortimer out of fear rather than conviction. He issued pardons freely, preferring to win over former enemies rather than to create new ones through vindictive punishments. This policy of reconciliation helped to heal the divisions that had torn England apart during his father's reign and the years of Mortimer's regency. The young king's government was characterised by energy and efficiency. Edward took a personal interest in the details of administration, reviewing accounts, hearing petitions, and supervising the work of his officials. He travelled constantly throughout his kingdom, showing himself to his subjects and dispensing justice in person. He held frequent parliaments, consulting with his nobles and commons on matters of taxation and legislation, building a consensus for his policies rather than attempting to rule by decree. Edward's court quickly became one of the most magnificent in Europe. The king loved display and ceremony, and he used the splendour of his court to enhance his prestige and to impress foreign visitors. Tournaments were held frequently, elaborate affairs with hundreds of participants, featuring jousting and feasting that lasted for days. The king himself was an enthusiastic participant, renowned for his skill with lance and sword. The Queen, Philippa of Hainault, played an important role in the life of the court. She was a gracious hostess and a generous patron of artists and scholars, and she provided Edward with a stable and happy domestic life. Their first son, Edward, was born in June of 1330, just months before the coup at Nottingham. More children followed in rapid succession, ensuring the succession and providing the king with a growing family that he cherished. But Edward's ambitions extended far beyond the borders of England. He dreamed of military glory, of conquests that would rival those of his grandfather, Edward I, or even of the legendary kings of old. And the opportunity for such glory soon presented itself in the form of unfinished business with Scotland and a growing crisis in relations with France. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed during Mortimer's regency, had recognised Scottish independence and renounced English claims to overlordship. But Edward had never accepted this treaty, which he regarded as a shameful surrender forced upon him by Mortimer. He began, almost immediately, to look for ways to reverse its terms and to restore English dominance over Scotland. The opportunity came sooner than expected. King Robert Bruce of Scotland died in 1329, leaving his throne to his young son David, who was only 5 years old. Scotland was governed by regents during David's minority, and the kingdom was soon torn by internal conflicts. A group of Scottish nobles who had been dispossessed by Robert Bruce, known as the Disinherited, appealed to Edward for help in recovering their lands. Edward could not openly support the Disinherited without violating the treaty he had sworn to uphold, but he could and did provide covert assistance, allowing the exiles to recruit soldiers in England and to use English ports for their invasion. In 1332, an army of the Disinherited, led by Edward Balliol, son of the former Scottish King John Balliol, crossed into Scotland and defeated the forces of the Regency at the Battle of Duplin Moor. Balliol was crowned King of Scotland at Scone in September 1332, but his hold on power was precarious. Within months he had been driven out of the country by supporters of the young King David, and he fled to England to seek Edward's protection. This time, Edward decided to intervene openly. In 1333, he led an English army north to restore Balliol to the Scottish throne. The campaign of 1333 marked Edward's first experience of commanding an army in the field, and it would prove to be a triumphant beginning to his military career. The young king was just 20 years old, but he approached the challenge with the confidence and energy that would characterise all his military endeavours. The immediate objective was the town of Berwick, a strategic fortress on the border between England and Scotland. Berwick had changed hands repeatedly during the long wars between the two kingdoms, and its possession was considered essential for controlling the eastern border. Edward laid siege to the town in the spring of 1333, surrounding it with his army and cutting off all supplies. The Scottish regents could not allow Berwick to fall without a fight. They gathered their forces and marched south to relieve the siege, hoping to catch the English army between the town's garrison and their own forces. Edward learned of their approach and prepared to meet them in battle. He chose his ground carefully, positioning his army on Halidon Hill, a ridge overlooking the road that the Scots would have to take to reach Berwick. The Battle of Halidon Hill, fought on July 19, 1333, was a devastating English victory. Edward employed tactics that would become the hallmark of English military success for the next century, combining dismounted men-at-arms with massed longbowmen to create a defensive formation of extraordinary killing power. The English longbow was a fearsome weapon, capable of sending arrows with tremendous force over distances of 200 yards or more. A skilled archer could loose 10 or 12 arrows per minute, and an army of several thousand archers could create a storm of missiles that no attacking force could withstand. The Scots at Halidon Hill learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. The Scottish army advanced up the slope toward the English position, struggling through boggy ground that slowed their progress and broke up their formations. As they came within range, the English archers began to shoot. Arrows fell among the Scots like deadly rain, piercing armour and flesh, bringing down men and horses in terrible numbers. Those who survived the arrow storm and reached the English lines found themselves facing fresh men-at-arms, well rested and fighting from a position of advantage. The Scottish army was destroyed. Thousands were killed on the field, including many of the leading nobles of the kingdom. The survivors fled in disorder, pursued by English cavalry who cut them down without mercy. Berwick surrendered the following day, and Edward Balliol was restored to the Scottish throne. The victory at Halidon Hill established Edward's reputation as a military commander and demonstrated the effectiveness of the tactical system that English armies would employ throughout the 100 Years' War. The combination of longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms fighting from carefully chosen defensive positions would prove almost unbeatable against the traditional cavalry charges favoured by continental armies. But the Scottish wars were far from over. Balliol's hold on power remained tenuous, dependent entirely on English military support. The young King David and his supporters had fled to France, where they found refuge at the court of King Philip VI. From this safe haven, they continued to direct resistance against Balliol and his English backers. Edward launched several more campaigns into Scotland over the following years, each time winning victories, but never managing to establish permanent control. The Scots refused to meet the English in pitched battle after the disaster at Halidon Hill, instead waging a guerrilla war of raids and ambushes that wore down the invaders without risking another catastrophic defeat. English garrisons held the major towns and castles, but the countryside remained hostile, and no amount of military force could compel the Scottish people to accept Balliol as their king. The Scottish wars consumed enormous resources and yielded diminishing returns. By the late 1330s, Edward was beginning to lose interest in the northern kingdom. His attention was increasingly drawn to a larger and more glittering prize, the crown of France itself. The conflict with Scotland would continue to simmer throughout Edward's reign, flaring up occasionally into open warfare, but it would never again command the king's full attention. The real drama of Edward's reign, the conflict that would define his legacy and reshape the map of Europe, was about to begin. The roots of the conflict with France stretched back generations to the days when English kings had ruled vast territories on the continent. Henry II, who reigned in the 12th century, had controlled an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, including all of western France. But his successors had lost most of these territories, and by Edward's time only Gascony remained in English hands. Gascony, that sun-drenched region in southwestern France, was the source of endless complications in Anglo-French relations. The English king held Gascony as a fief of the French crown, which meant that he owed homage and feudal service to the French king for these lands. This arrangement was deeply humiliating for English monarchs, who considered themselves the equals of any king in Christendom, yet were required to kneel before the French king and acknowledge his overlordship. The French kings, for their part, used their feudal rights over Gascony to interfere constantly in English affairs. They heard appeals from Gascon subjects who were dissatisfied with English rule. They demanded military service from the English king, and they threatened to confiscate the duchy whenever relations between the two kingdoms deteriorated. The situation was inherently unstable, a source of friction that periodically erupted into open conflict. The crisis that would ignite the 100 Years' War began with a question of succession. In 1328, King Charles IV of France died without a male heir. Charles was the last of the direct Capetian line, the dynasty that had ruled France for over 300 years. His death created a succession crisis that would have profound consequences for both France and England. Edward III had a strong claim to the French throne. His mother Isabella was the sister of Charles IV and the daughter of Philip IV, which made Edward the nearest male relative of the deceased king through the female line. If women could transmit the right to rule, then Edward was the rightful king of France. But the French nobility had no intention of accepting an English king. They invoked an ancient law, supposedly dating back to the Frankish tribes, which prohibited inheritance through the female line. This law, known as the Salic law, had never actually been applied to the French succession before, but it provided a convenient justification for excluding Edward. Instead, the French crown passed to Philip of Valois, a cousin of the deceased king through the male line, who became King Philip VI. Edward initially accepted this outcome, at least publicly. He was only 15 years old in 1328, still under the control of Mortimer and Isabella, and in no position to press his claim by force. He even travelled to France in 1329 to perform homage to Philip for Gascony, acknowledging the new king's authority, but he never forgot his claim to the French throne, and he never truly accepted Philip as the legitimate king of France. Relations between Edward and Philip deteriorated steadily throughout the 1330s. The French king provided shelter and support to the exiled Scottish king David Bruce, using Scotland as a tool to distract and weaken England. He interfered in Gascon affairs with increasing boldness, hearing appeals, and issuing judgments that undermined English authority. He demanded that Edward fulfill his feudal obligations by providing military service for French campaigns, obligations that Edward resented and resisted. The situation reached a breaking point in 1337. Philip VI declared Gascony confiscated, claiming that Edward had failed to fulfill his feudal duties. This was an act of war, a direct attack on English interests that Edward could not ignore. The king responded by formally claiming the throne of France, asserting that Philip was a usurper and that he, Edward, was the rightful king. This claim transformed the nature of the conflict. What might have been a limited war over Gascony became a struggle for the French crown itself, a war that would last, with interruptions, for over a century. Edward adopted the arms of France, quartering the French fleur-de-lis with the English lions on his royal coat of arms. He styled himself King of France and England, a title that English monarchs would continue to claim for centuries to come. The early years of the war were frustrating for Edward. He lacked the resources to mount a major invasion of France, and his initial campaigns achieved little of lasting significance. In 1338, he led an army to the Low Countries, hoping to attack France from the north with the help of Flemish and German allies. But the campaign bogged down in fruitless negotiations and inconclusive skirmishing, and Edward returned to England, having accomplished nothing. The following year brought more disappointment. Edward's allies proved unreliable, demanding enormous subsidies while providing little actual military support. The king spent vast sums on diplomacy and preparation, but the great battle he sought remained elusive. The French refused to meet him in the field, preferring to wait behind their fortifications while Edward's resources dwindled. The one bright spot in these early years was the naval Battle of Sluys, fought in June of 1340, A large French fleet had gathered in the harbour of Sluys, on the coast of Flanders, threatening English shipping and preparing for a possible invasion of England. Edward gathered his own fleet and sailed to meet them. The battle that followed was one of the greatest naval engagements of the medieval period. The French ships were chained together in defensive formation, creating a floating fortress that the English would have to storm. Edward's fleet attacked at dawn, his archers pouring arrows into the packed French vessels, while his men-at-arms prepared to board. The fighting was savage and prolonged, lasting throughout the day and into the evening. The English longbowmen proved as deadly at sea as they were on land, sweeping the French decks with volleys of arrows that made it impossible for the defenders to fight effectively. One by one, the French ships were captured or sunk, their crews killed or driven into the sea. By nightfall, the French fleet had been virtually annihilated. Contemporary accounts claim that nearly 200 French ships were captured or destroyed, along with thousands of sailors and soldiers. The threat of French invasion was eliminated for a generation, and English control of the Channel was established beyond challenge. The victory at Sluys was a tremendous boost to English morale, but it did not fundamentally change the strategic situation. Edward still lacked the strength to conquer France, and his continental allies remained unreliable. The war settled into a pattern of raids and skirmishes, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Financial pressures mounted as the war dragged on. Edward had borrowed heavily from Italian banking houses to fund his campaigns, and by 1340 he was deeply in debt. The great Florentine banks of the Bardi and Peruzzi had lent the English crown enormous sums, secured by the revenues of the wool trade. When Edward defaulted on these loans, both banks collapsed, sending shockwaves through the European financial system. The king was forced to return to England and face the consequences of his failed campaigns. Parliament was summoned, and Edward had to endure the humiliation of explaining his lack of progress and requesting additional funds. The Commons were reluctant to grant more taxes for a war that seemed to produce nothing but expense, and Edward had to make significant concessions to secure their support. But the king was not discouraged. He continued to plan and prepare, waiting for the opportunity that he knew would eventually come. He reformed the administration of the army, improving recruitment and supply systems. He invested in the production of longbows and arrows, ensuring that his archers would never lack for weapons. And he cultivated relationships with potential allies in France, nobles who were dissatisfied with Valois rule and might be persuaded to support his claim. The opportunity Edward had been waiting for came in 1346. A succession dispute in Brittany had created a civil war in that strategically important duchy, with one faction supported by France and the other seeking English help. Edward saw a chance to establish a foothold in northwestern France, threatening Paris from a new direction and stretching French resources to the breaking point. In July of 1346, Edward landed in Normandy with an army of perhaps 15,000 men. It was a relatively small force for such an ambitious campaign, but it was superbly trained and equipped, and it was led by a king who had learned from his earlier failures and was determined to achieve a decisive victory. The campaign that followed would make Edward's reputation as one of the great military commanders of the medieval age. It would produce one of the most famous battles in English history and would shift the balance of power in Western Europe for a generation. The road to Crécy had begun. The Normandy campaign of 1346 began with a devastating march through some of the richest territory in France. Edward landed at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue on the Cotentin Peninsula on July 12th and immediately began advancing inland. His strategy was the chevauchée, a mounted raid designed to destroy enemy resources, undermine enemy morale, and provoke the enemy into battle. The English army moved with terrifying efficiency. Towns and villages were plundered and burned, crops were destroyed, livestock was driven off. The wealthy Norman countryside, which had known peace for generations, was transformed into a wasteland. Caen, the second city of Normandy, fell to the English on July 26th after a brief but bloody assault. The sack of Caen yielded enormous plunder, including treasure that had to be shipped back to England in a fleet of commandeered vessels. King Philip of France gathered his forces and marched to intercept the English. He had a significant advantage in numbers, with an army perhaps 3 times the size of Edward's, and he was confident of victory. The French nobility was eager for battle, burning to avenge the devastation of Normandy and to capture or kill the English king. Edward, meanwhile, continued his march northward, heading for the Flemish border, where he hoped to link up with Allied forces. But the French moved faster than expected, and by mid-August, Edward found his path blocked by Philip's army. The English were trapped between the French host and the River Somme, with no obvious way to escape. The situation seemed desperate. The French had destroyed or guarded all the bridges over the Somme, and the river was too deep to ford. Edward's army was running low on supplies, and the pursuing French were closing in. Some of the English commanders urged an immediate attack, preferring to die fighting rather than be trapped and destroyed. But Edward kept his nerve, searching for a way across the river. The solution came from a local prisoner who revealed the existence of a tidal ford called Blanche-Taquet, where the Somme could be crossed at low tide. Edward led his army to the ford on August 24th, arriving just as the tide was going out. The crossing was contested by a French force on the opposite bank, but the English archers and men-at-arms fought their way across, driving off the defenders and securing the northern bank. The army was saved, but Edward knew that battle was now inevitable. Philip was close behind, and there was no possibility of reaching Flanders before the French caught up. The English king decided to stand and fight, choosing his ground with the careful eye of an experienced commander. The position Edward selected was a ridge near the village of Crécy, overlooking a gentle slope that any attacker would have to climb. The ridge was flanked by natural obstacles, a forest on one side and the village itself on the other, which would prevent the French from outflanking the English position. It was an ideal defensive position, and Edward set about preparing it for battle. The English army was organised into 3 divisions, or battles. The right division was commanded by Edward's eldest son, the 16-year-old Prince Edward, who would later be known as the Black Prince. The left division was commanded by the Earl of Northampton. The king himself commanded the reserve, positioned on a windmill-topped hill, where he could observe the entire battlefield and commit his forces where they were needed. The archers were positioned on the flanks of each division, angled forward so that they could pour converging fire into any attacking force. The men-at-arms were dismounted and formed up in dense blocks, their horses sent to the rear. Pits were dug in front of the position to break up cavalry charges. Everything was done to maximise the defensive advantages of the position and to neutralise the French superiority in numbers. The French army arrived on the afternoon of August 26th, having marched hard to catch the English. Philip's advisers urged him to wait until the following day to attack, giving his troops time to rest and allowing him to properly reconnoitre the English position. But the French nobles were impatient, eager to close with the enemy and win glory in battle. Against his better judgment, Philip ordered an immediate attack. The assault began with an advance by Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries in French service, who were considered among the best missile troops in Europe. But the crossbowmen were tired from their march. Their weapons were wet from a brief rainstorm, and they were hopelessly outmatched by the English longbowmen. As the Genoese advanced, the English archers opened fire. The effect was devastating. The longbows had greater range and a much faster rate of fire than the crossbows, and the English arrows fell among the Genoese in a deadly hail. The crossbowmen broke and fled, streaming back toward their own lines in panic. The French knights, furious at what they saw as cowardice, rode down the fleeing Genoese, trampling them beneath their horses' hoofs. Then the French cavalry charged. Wave after wave of armoured knights spurred their horses up the slope toward the English position, their banners streaming behind them, their war cries echoing across the field. It was a magnificent sight, the flower of French chivalry riding to battle, confident in their courage and their martial prowess. But courage was not enough. The English arrows fell among the charging knights like a deadly rain, piercing armour, killing horses, bringing down riders in tangled heaps. Those who survived the arrow storm and reached the English lines found themselves facing a wall of dismounted men-at-arms, fresh and ready, fighting from a position of advantage. The charges broke against the English line like waves against a cliff, each assault weaker than the last. The fighting continued until well after dark, with the French launching charge after charge in desperate attempts to break the English position. None succeeded. By the time the French finally withdrew, thousands of their best knights lay dead on the field, including some of the greatest nobles of the realm. The Count of Alençon, the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the King of Bohemia, all fell at Crécy, along with perhaps 1,500 other knights and nobles. The English losses were minimal, perhaps a few hundred killed and wounded. The disparity was staggering, a testament to the effectiveness of Edward's tactics and the deadly power of the English longbow. Crécy was not just a victory, it was a revolution in warfare, demonstrating that disciplined infantry could defeat the armoured cavalry that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. The aftermath of the battle was grim. The following morning, Edward sent heralds to count the dead, and they returned with lists of the fallen that shocked all of Europe. The French army had been shattered, its leadership decimated, its confidence destroyed. Philip himself had been wounded in the battle and had barely escaped capture. Edward did not pursue the retreating French. His army was too small to exploit the victory fully, and he had other objectives in mind. Instead, he marched north to the port of Calais, which he intended to capture and hold as a permanent English base on the continent. The siege of Calais lasted nearly a year, from September 1346 to August 1347. The town was strongly fortified and stubbornly defended, and Edward lacked the strength to take it by assault. Instead, he surrounded it with a blockade, cutting off all supplies and waiting for starvation to do its work. The siege was a test of endurance for both sides. The defenders of Calais held out with remarkable determination, surviving on ever-diminishing rations while hoping for relief from France. But Philip was unable to gather another army strong enough to challenge Edward, and no relief came. By the summer of 1347, the garrison was reduced to eating horses, dogs, and rats, and further resistance was impossible. The surrender of Calais produced one of the most famous episodes of Edward's reign. The king, furious at the length of the siege and the losses it had cost him, demanded that 6 leading citizens of the town present themselves for execution. The 6 burghers of Calais, as they came to be known, came before Edward with ropes around their necks, prepared to die to save their fellow citizens. It was Queen Philippa who saved them. She threw herself at her husband's feet, begging him to spare the burghers for the sake of the child she was carrying. Edward, moved by his wife's pleas, relented, and the 6 men were allowed to live. The episode became a symbol of royal mercy, celebrated in art and literature for centuries afterward. Calais would remain in English hands for over 200 years, a valuable base for trade and military operations on the continent. Its capture was the crowning achievement of the 1346 campaign, cementing Edward's reputation as a conqueror and establishing English power in France on a permanent basis. The victory at Crécy and the capture of Calais transformed Edward's position. He was no longer just a claimant to the French throne, but a proven conqueror who had humiliated the might of France on the battlefield. His prestige soared throughout Europe, and princes and nobles sought his alliance and his favour. The war was far from over, but Edward had established himself as the dominant figure in Western European politics. The triumph of Crécy and Calais was followed by one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. In 1348, a terrible plague arrived in England, a disease that would kill perhaps a third of the population and transform every aspect of English society. This was the Black Death, and its impact on Edward's reign and on the course of English history cannot be overstated. The plague had originated somewhere in Central Asia, spreading westward along the trade routes that connected east and west. It reached the Mediterranean in 1347, carried by Genoese trading ships fleeing from a Mongol siege. From the ports of Italy, it spread with terrifying speed throughout Europe, leaving death and devastation in its wake. The disease arrived in England through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, probably in June of 1348. Within weeks it had spread throughout the southwestern counties. By autumn it had reached London. By the following spring it had penetrated every corner of the kingdom. The symptoms of the plague were horrifying. Victims developed painful swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpit, and neck, swellings that could grow to the size of eggs or apples. These buboes, as they were called, gave the disease its common name, the bubonic plague. Victims also suffered from high fever, severe headaches, and a general feeling of weakness and despair. Most died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. Even more terrifying was the pneumonic form of the plague, which attacked the lungs and could be transmitted directly from person to person through coughing and sneezing. This form was almost invariably fatal, often killing within 24 hours of infection. Those who contracted it coughed up blood and struggled to breathe as their lungs filled with fluid. The death toll was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that between 30 and 50% of England's population died during the initial outbreak of 1348 and 1349. Some villages were entirely wiped out, their inhabitants dead or fled. Cities saw mass graves dug to accommodate the overwhelming number of corpses. The normal rituals of death and burial broke down completely, as there was simply not enough living to care for the dead. Edward's own family was touched by the plague. His daughter Joan, who was travelling to Spain to marry the heir to the Castilian throne, died of the disease in Bordeaux in September 1348. She was just 14 years old, and her death was a devastating blow to her parents. The king wrote a letter to the King of Castile explaining what had happened, a letter that survives to this day and reveals Edward's grief in poignant terms. The social and economic consequences of the plague were profound. The sudden reduction in population created an acute labour shortage. Peasants who had survived the plague found that their labour was now valuable, and they began demanding higher wages and better conditions. Landlords who had relied on cheap and abundant labour suddenly faced a crisis as workers left their traditional holdings in search of better opportunities elsewhere. The government attempted to control this situation through legislation. The Ordinance of Labourers issued in 1349 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to prevent workers from leaving their traditional employers. The Statute of Labourers, passed by Parliament in 1351, reinforced these provisions and established penalties for both workers who demanded excessive wages and employers who paid them. These laws were only partially effective. The economic forces unleashed by the plague were too powerful to be contained by legislation, and the labour market continued to favour workers over employers. The long-term result was a gradual improvement in the conditions of the English peasantry, as landlords were forced to offer better terms to attract and retain workers. The plague also had profound psychological and religious effects. Many people interpreted the catastrophe as divine punishment for human sinfulness, and movements of extreme piety swept through Europe. Flagellants marched through the streets, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. Others turned to scapegoating, blaming Jews, foreigners, or other marginalised groups for supposedly causing the plague through poisoning wells or practising witchcraft. In England, the religious response was somewhat more measured, but the plague nonetheless left deep marks on the national psyche. Church attendance increased, at least initially, as people sought comfort and explanation for the disaster that had befallen them. Charitable bequests to churches and religious houses increased dramatically, as survivors sought to ensure the salvation of their souls and those of their departed loved ones. The plague also disrupted the war with France. Both kingdoms were too devastated to continue large-scale military operations, and an informal truce settled over the conflict. Edward used this pause to consolidate his gains and to rebuild his kingdom's strength. The revenues of the crown had been severely reduced by the death of so many taxpayers, and the king had to adjust his ambitions accordingly. The plague returned periodically throughout the remainder of Edward's reign, though never with the same devastating intensity as the initial outbreak. Each recurrence carried off more victims and reminded survivors of their mortality and the fragility of human existence. The psychological shadow of the Black Death hung over England for generations, influencing art, literature, and religious thought in ways that are still visible today. Despite the catastrophe, Edward's reign continued. The king proved resilient in the face of disaster, maintaining order and governance even as his kingdom reeled from the plague's impact. He adapted his policies to the new circumstances, adjusting taxation and military recruitment to account for the reduced population. And when the opportunity arose to resume the war with France, he was ready to seize it. The 1350s saw a remarkable revival of English military fortunes in France. The plague had weakened both kingdoms, but England recovered more quickly, and Edward was soon ready to resume offensive operations. The campaigns of this decade would produce another stunning English victory, and would bring the war to a triumphant, if temporary, conclusion. The hero of this phase of the war was not Edward himself, but his eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince. The prince had distinguished himself at Crécy, where at just 16 years of age he had commanded one of the 3 English divisions. In the years since he had grown into a formidable warrior and commander, embodying all the chivalric virtues that his father prized. In 1355, the Black Prince was appointed the king's lieutenant in Gascony, with authority to conduct military operations in southwestern France. He arrived in Bordeaux in September with a small but experienced army, and immediately began planning a major chevauchée into French territory. The campaign of 1355 took the prince deep into the heart of southern France. His army marched from Bordeaux to the Mediterranean coast and back again, covering over 600 miles in 2 months. Along the way, they burned and plundered with systematic thoroughness, destroying towns and villages, capturing enormous quantities of loot, and demonstrating that the French king was powerless to protect his own subjects. The chevauchée was a strategic success, but it was only a prelude to the greater campaign of the following year. In 1356, the Black Prince set out again, this time marching northward toward the Loire Valley, the heartland of France. His objective was to link up with another English army operating from Normandy and to bring the French to battle. King John II of France, who had succeeded his father Philip in 1350, gathered his forces to intercept the prince. John was determined to avenge the humiliation of Crécy and to destroy the English army that was ravaging his kingdom. He assembled a host that outnumbered the English by perhaps 3-1 and marched south to bring the prince to battle. The two armies met near the city of Poitiers on September 19th, 1356. The Black Prince, finding his retreat blocked by the French, chose a defensive position similar to the one his father had used at Crécy. His army occupied a ridge protected by hedges and vineyards, with their flanks secured by woods and marshland. The archers were positioned to pour fire into any attacking force, and the men-at-arms were dismounted and ready to receive the French charge. The Battle of Poitiers followed a pattern similar to Crécy, but with some significant differences. The French, having learned from their earlier defeat, dismounted most of their knights and advanced on foot, hoping to reduce their vulnerability to English arrows. But this tactic proved no more successful than the cavalry charges at Crécy. The dismounted French knights, weighed down by their heavy armour, struggled to advance through the difficult terrain, and the English arrows took a terrible toll. The battle raged for hours, with the French launching repeated attacks against the English position. Each assault was beaten back with heavy losses, but the French kept coming, driven by their king's determination to achieve victory. John himself fought in the thick of the battle, wielding a battle-axe and rallying his men with conspicuous courage. The turning point came when the Black Prince ordered a counter-attack. The English men-at-arms, who had been fighting on the defensive all day, suddenly mounted their horses and charged into the exhausted French ranks. The effect was devastating. The French line broke, and what had been an orderly battle became a rout. King John fought on even as his army collapsed around him. He was eventually surrounded by English soldiers and forced to surrender. The capture of the French king was an almost unprecedented event, a triumph that exceeded even the victory at Crécy. Along with John, the English captured his youngest son Philip and dozens of the greatest nobles of France. The aftermath of Poitiers was even more significant than the battle itself. With their king a prisoner, the French were forced to negotiate from a position of extreme weakness. The kingdom descended into chaos, with rival factions competing for power and peasant revolts breaking out across the countryside. The Jacquerie, as the peasant uprising was called, was eventually suppressed with great brutality, but it demonstrated the depth of the crisis that the French monarchy faced. Edward III came to France in person to negotiate the terms of King John's release. The initial terms he demanded were extraordinarily harsh, including the cession of vast territories and the payment of an enormous ransom. The French rejected these terms, and the war continued for several more years. Finally, in 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny brought the first phase of the 100 Years' War to an end. The terms were still highly favourable to England, though less extreme than Edward's initial demands. France agreed to pay a ransom of 3 million gold crowns for King John's release, a sum so vast that it would take years to collect. Edward received full sovereignty over an expanded Gascony, including the wealthy regions of Poitou, Saintonge, and Limousin, as well as the county of Poitiers in northern France and the town of Calais. In return, Edward agreed to renounce his claim to the French throne. The Treaty of Bretigny marked the high point of Edward's reign. He had achieved what no English king before him had accomplished, forcing France to cede vast territories and to acknowledge English power on the continent. His son the Black Prince was recognised as one of the greatest warriors of the age. The English treasury was enriched by the ransoms of King John and the many French nobles captured at Poitiers. It seemed that Edward had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish. But the peace would not last. The terms of the treaty were never fully implemented, with both sides finding reasons to delay or evade their obligations. The renunciation clauses, by which Edward was to give up his claim to the French throne, in exchange for full sovereignty over his continental possessions, were never formally exchanged. This legal ambiguity would provide the pretext for renewed warfare in the years to come. For the moment, however, Edward could savour his triumph. He returned to England as a conquering hero, celebrated by his subjects and admired throughout Europe. The kingdom he ruled was the most powerful in Western Europe, and his dynasty seemed secure for generations to come. The future looked bright, even as the shadows were already beginning to gather. The reign of Edward III was not only an age of military triumph, but also a golden age of English chivalry. The king was a passionate devotee of the chivalric ideal, and he worked throughout his reign to promote the values of knighthood and to create a court culture that celebrated martial prowess, honour, and noble conduct. The centrepiece of Edward's chivalric programme was the Order of the Garter, the oldest and most prestigious order of knighthood in England. The order was founded in 1348, probably in the aftermath of the Crécy campaign, though the exact circumstances of its creation are obscured by legend and uncertainty. The most famous story about the order's founding involves the Countess of Salisbury, whose garter supposedly fell off while she was dancing with the king at a court ball. When the watching courtiers snickered at this embarrassing incident, Edward is said to have picked up the garter, tied it around his own leg, and declared in French, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," meaning "shame on him who thinks evil of it." This phrase became the motto of the order. Whether this story is true or merely a romantic legend, the Order of the Garter quickly became the most exclusive honour in England. Membership was limited to the king and 25 knight companions, each one chosen for his exceptional valour and service to the crown. The original members included many of the heroes of the French wars, men like the Earl of Warwick, the Earl of Salisbury, and Sir John Chandos, as well as the Black Prince and other members of the royal family. The order was dedicated to the Virgin Mary and to St. George, the warrior saint who had become the patron of England. Its spiritual home was the Chapel of St. George at Windsor Castle, which Edward rebuilt and enlarged to serve as the order's headquarters. The chapel became one of the architectural glories of medieval England, a fitting setting for the ceremonies and rituals that bound the Garter Knights together. The Knights of the Garter were required to attend an annual feast on St. George's Day, April 23rd, at which they renewed their vows and celebrated their fellowship. They wore distinctive robes of blue and gold, with the garter itself displayed prominently on the left leg. The order's ceremonies were elaborate and impressive, designed to inspire awe and to reinforce the bonds of loyalty that connected the knights to their sovereign. The Order of the Garter was part of a broader European phenomenon. The 14th century saw the creation of numerous chivalric orders across the continent, as kings and princes sought to bind their greatest warriors to them through ties of honour and fellowship. The Order of the Star in France, the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy, and many others followed the pattern established by Edward's creation. Beyond the Order of the Garter, Edward promoted chivalric culture through tournaments, pageants, and other public spectacles. Tournaments were held frequently throughout his reign, elaborate affairs that combined martial competition with theatrical display. Knights jousted for honour and prizes, demonstrating their skill with lance and sword before audiences of nobles and commoners alike. Edward himself was an enthusiastic participant in these tournaments, at least in his younger years. He was renowned for his skill in the joust and for the magnificence of his equipment and retinue. The king often appeared in elaborate disguises, playing roles from Arthurian legend or ancient history, adding an element of theatre to the martial competition. The Arthurian legends held a particular fascination for Edward and his court. King Arthur, the legendary British king who had supposedly ruled in the centuries after the Roman withdrawal, was seen as the model of the perfect monarch, a warrior king who had united Britain and established a court renowned for its chivalry and justice. Edward consciously modelled himself on Arthur, and he encouraged the identification between his own reign and the legendary glories of Camelot. In 1344, Edward held a great tournament at Windsor, at which he announced his intention to create a round table, an order of 300 knights, modelled on Arthur's legendary fellowship. This ambitious plan was never fully realised, probably because of the outbreak of the French War and the financial pressures it created. But the idea evolved into the Order of the Garter, which achieved the same goal of binding the kingdom's greatest warriors to the crown through ties of honour and fellowship. The chivalric culture of Edward's court had practical as well as symbolic purposes. The tournaments provided training for war, allowing knights to hone their skills in conditions that approximated actual combat. The orders of knighthood created networks of loyalty that transcended regional and factional divisions, uniting the nobility in service to the crown. The pageantry and display enhanced the prestige of the monarchy, impressing both domestic and foreign audiences with the power and magnificence of the English king. Edward's court also became a centre of literary and artistic patronage. The king supported poets and chroniclers who celebrated his achievements and those of his knights. Jean Froissart, the great chronicler of the 100 Years' War, spent time at Edward's court and dedicated his work to Queen Philippa. Geoffrey Chaucer, who would become the greatest English poet of the medieval period, began his career as a page in the household of the king's son, Lionel. The visual arts also flourished under Edward's patronage. The king commissioned elaborate building projects, including the reconstruction of Windsor Castle and the expansion of Westminster Palace. He employed skilled craftsmen to create magnificent objects of gold and silver, jewelled crowns and sceptres, illuminated manuscripts, and embroidered vestments. The material culture of Edward's court was designed to impress, to demonstrate the wealth and power of the English monarchy. Music played an important role in court life as well. The Chapel Royal, the king's personal choir, performed elaborate polyphonic music for religious services and court entertainments. Minstrels and musicians entertained at feasts and celebrations, playing instruments like the harp, the lute, the rebec, and the shawm. Dancing was a popular pastime among the nobility, and the court employed dancing masters to teach the latest steps and figures. The Queen, Philippa of Hainault, was particularly important in shaping the cultural life of the court. She brought with her from the Low Countries a taste for Flemish art and music, and she patronised artists and craftsmen throughout her time as queen. Her household was a centre of refinement and learning, and she encouraged the education of the young nobles who served as pages and attendants. Philippa was also renowned for her charitable works. She founded Queen's College at Oxford University in 1341, providing for the education of poor scholars who might otherwise have been unable to pursue learning. She interceded frequently with her husband on behalf of those who had fallen into disfavour, and her reputation for mercy and compassion made her beloved throughout the kingdom. The court of Edward III was thus a place of remarkable vitality and creativity, a centre of military prowess and cultural achievement that drew admiration from across Europe. The king had succeeded in creating a court culture that reflected his own values and ambitions, a culture that celebrated martial virtue while also embracing the finer things of life. It was a legacy that would influence English culture for centuries to come. But the golden age could not last forever. Even as Edward celebrated his triumphs and enjoyed the pleasures of his court, the forces that would bring his reign to a troubled close were already at work. The next decades would bring tragedy, loss, and decline, testing the aging king in ways he could never have anticipated. The family of Edward III was one of the largest and most remarkable of any medieval English king. Edward and Philippa had at least 13 children who survived infancy, an extraordinary number that reflected both the Queen's fertility and the relatively good health that the royal family enjoyed. These children would play crucial roles in the history of England for generations to come, and the complex web of their descendants would eventually lead to the dynastic conflicts of the 15th century. The eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, was the pride of his father's heart. Born in 1330, he had grown into one of the most celebrated warriors of his age, the hero of Crécy and Poitiers, the embodiment of chivalric virtue. After the Treaty of Bretigny, the Black Prince was created Prince of Aquitaine, ruling the vast English territories in southwestern France as his father's representative. The prince established his court at Bordeaux, surrounding himself with knights and nobles who shared his passion for warfare and chivalry. He married Joan of Kent, known as the Fair Maid of Kent, in 1361. Joan was a controversial choice, as she had been married twice before and was older than the prince, but the marriage was apparently a love match, and it produced 2 sons, Edward and Richard. The second surviving son of Edward and Philippa was Lionel of Antwerp, born in 1338. Lionel was a giant of a man, reportedly standing nearly 7 feet tall, and he played an important role in his father's government. He served as the king's lieutenant in Ireland, attempting to restore English authority over that troubled lordship, and he was created Duke of Clarence in 1362. Lionel died in 1368, shortly after his second marriage to a member of the powerful Visconti family of Milan. John of Gaunt, born in 1340, was the third surviving son and would prove to be the most politically significant of Edward's children. He was named after his birthplace, Ghent in Flanders, and he grew into a man of considerable ability and ambition. Through his first marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, he acquired the vast Lancastrian inheritance, becoming the wealthiest noble in England. He was created Duke of Lancaster in 1362, and he would play a dominant role in English politics for the remainder of the century. Edmund of Langley, born in 1341, was the 4th surviving son. He was a less forceful personality than his brothers, more interested in hunting and leisure than in politics or warfare. He was created Duke of York in 1385 and founded the House of York, whose descendants would eventually challenge the Lancastrian line for the throne. Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest son, was born in 1355. He would become Duke of Gloucester and would play a turbulent role in the politics of his nephew Richard II's reign. His violent death in 1397, almost certainly murder, would contribute to the crisis that eventually brought down the Ricardian monarchy. Edward and Philippa also had several daughters who survived to adulthood. Isabella, born in 1332, was the eldest and remained unmarried throughout her life, an unusual situation for a royal princess. Joan, born in 1333 or 34, died of plague in 1348 while travelling to Spain for her marriage. Mary, born in 1344, married John of Brittany and played an important role in the complex politics of that duchy. Margaret, born in 1346, married John Hastings, Earl of Pembroke. This large family was both a blessing and a potential source of conflict. Edward had provided abundantly for his sons, creating them dukes and endowing them with vast estates. But this generosity created powerful magnates whose interests did not always align with those of the crown. The tensions between the royal brothers would simmer throughout the later years of Edward's reign, and would explode into open conflict under his successor. The 1360s began well for Edward and his family. The Treaty of Bretigny had brought peace with France, and the king could enjoy the fruits of his victories. The ransoms paid for King John and the French nobles captured at Poitiers filled the treasury. English prestige stood at its highest point in generations. The future seemed secure. But troubles soon began to accumulate. The peace with France proved fragile, as neither side fully implemented the terms of the treaty. The renunciation clauses, by which Edward was to give up his claim to the French throne, in exchange for full sovereignty over his continental possessions, were never formally exchanged. Both sides found reasons to delay, and the legal ambiguity left the door open for renewed conflict. In Spain, a civil war between Peter the Cruel of Castile and his illegitimate half-brother Henry of Trastamara drew in the major powers of Western Europe. France supported Henry, seeing an opportunity to distract England and to gain a valuable ally. The Black Prince, eager for military glory and hoping to secure Castilian support for England, led an army across the Pyrenees in 1367 to restore Peter to his throne. The campaign was initially successful. The prince won a brilliant victory at the Battle of Nadra in April 1367, defeating Henry's forces and restoring Peter to power. But the triumph soon turned to ashes. Peter failed to pay the enormous sums he had promised for the prince's assistance. The English army, stranded in Spain without supplies or money, began to melt away from the disease and desertion. And the prince himself fell ill with a mysterious ailment, probably dysentery, that would plague him for the rest of his life. The Spanish campaign was a turning point in the Black Prince's career. He returned to Aquitaine a sick man, his health permanently damaged, his treasury depleted, his reputation tarnished by the failure to secure payment from Peter. The prince attempted to recoup his losses by imposing heavy taxes on his Gascon subjects, but this only alienated the local nobility, who began to look to France for relief. In 1369, King Charles V of France, who had succeeded his father John, declared the Treaty of Bretigny void and announced the confiscation of Aquitaine. The war resumed, but this time the circumstances were very different. The French had learned from their earlier defeats and adopted a new strategy, avoiding pitched battles and instead wearing down the English through sieges, raids, and guerrilla warfare. The English found themselves unable to counter this strategy. The chevauchée, which had been so effective in the 1340s and 50s, now achieved little, as the French refused to defend their towns and simply waited for the English to exhaust themselves. One by one, the territories gained at Bretigny were lost, as French forces methodically reduced English strongholds throughout southwestern France. The Black Prince, too ill to campaign effectively, was forced to return to England in 1371. He would never recover his health, and he spent his remaining years as an invalid, watching helplessly as the empire he had helped to build crumbled away. His father, now approaching 60, was also showing signs of age and declining vigour. The loss of the French territories was a bitter blow to Edward, undoing much of what he had achieved in decades of warfare. By the mid-1370s, English possessions in France had been reduced to Calais and a narrow coastal strip around Bordeaux, essentially the same territories that Edward had held at the beginning of his reign. The great victories of Crécy and Poitiers seemed to have been won in vain. Domestic troubles compounded the foreign setbacks. The costs of the renewed war strained the treasury, and Parliament became increasingly reluctant to grant additional taxes. The Commons complained of corruption and mismanagement in the royal government, and they demanded reforms that Edward was unwilling or unable to provide. The Good Parliament of 1376 marked a new phase in the relationship between Crown and Parliament. The Commons, emboldened by the King's weakness, launched an unprecedented attack on the royal administration. They impeached several of the King's ministers, including his Chamberlain William Latimer and his mistress Alice Perrers, accusing them of corruption and abuse of power. They demanded that the King govern with the advice of a council of nobles and prelates, limiting his freedom of action. Alice Perrers deserves particular mention, as her relationship with the ageing king became a source of scandal and controversy. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Philippa, who became Edward's mistress sometime in the late 1360s. After Philippa's death in 1369, Alice's influence over the king grew dramatically. She accumulated lands and wealth, interfered in legal proceedings, and was widely blamed for the corruption and misgovernment of the king's final years. The Good Parliament's attacks on Alice and the king's ministers reflected broader dissatisfaction with the direction of the reign. Edward, once the vigorous warrior king who had led his armies to victory in France, had become a feeble old man, dominated by his mistress and unable to control his own government. The contrast with the glories of earlier decades was painful and embarrassing. The Black Prince supported the Good Parliament's reforms, hoping to restore effective government and to secure the succession for his young son Richard. But the prince's health continued to decline, and he died on June 8, 1376, just a week before the Parliament concluded its business. He was only 45 years old, struck down in what should have been the prime of life. The death of the Black Prince was a devastating blow to Edward and to the kingdom. The prince had been the heir to the throne, the hero of a generation, the man who was expected to continue his father's legacy of military glory. His death left the succession in the hands of his 9-year-old son Richard, a child who would have to navigate the treacherous waters of English politics without the guidance of his famous father. Edward himself had only a year left to live. The old king, broken by grief and illness, retreated from public life. John of Gaunt, now the most powerful figure in the kingdom, dominated the government, reversing many of the Good Parliament's reforms and restoring the influence of those who had been impeached. Alice Perrers returned to court, resuming her place at the king's side. The final years of Edward III's reign were marked by sadness, loss, and the gradual unravelling of much that he had built. The vigorous king who had seized power at Nottingham Castle nearly 50 years earlier was now a shadow of his former self, aged beyond his years, weakened by illness, and overwhelmed by the troubles that beset his kingdom. The death of Queen Philippa in August of 1369 had been an early harbinger of the sorrows to come. Philippa had been Edward's companion for over 40 years, the mother of his children, the gracious queen who had softened his harsh judgments and interceded for those who had fallen into disfavour. Her death left a void in Edward's life that could never be filled. Philippa died at Windsor Castle, surrounded by her family, after a long illness that may have been dropsy or some similar condition. Edward was at her bedside, holding her hand as she passed. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, who had known the Queen personally, her last words were a request that Edward fulfil any promises she had made, and that he be buried beside her when his own time came. The king honoured both requests. He paid Philippa's debts and fulfilled her charitable bequests, and when he died 8 years later, he was buried beside her in Westminster Abbey. Their tomb, with its magnificent bronze effigies, can still be seen today, a testament to a partnership that had lasted more than 4 decades. The Queen's death seemed to accelerate Edward's decline. Without Philippa's steadying influence, the king fell increasingly under the sway of Alice Perrers and other self-interested courtiers. His judgment, once so sure and decisive, became erratic and unreliable. He withdrew from the active management of government, leaving power to be contested among his sons and their factions. The renewal of the French War in 1369 added military failure to personal loss. The strategy that had worked so well in the 1340s and 50s proved ineffective against the new French approach of avoiding battle and wearing down the English through attrition. The great captains who had won the earlier victories were dead or aging, and a new generation of commanders proved unable to match their achievements. John of Gaunt led several expeditions to France during the 1370s, but none achieved significant success. In 1373, he marched an army from Calais to Bordeaux, covering hundreds of miles through hostile territory. But the campaign accomplished nothing beyond demonstrating that the English could still move through France at will. The French simply withdrew before his advance, refusing battle and waiting for disease and desertion to weaken his forces. The financial strain of these unsuccessful campaigns was enormous. Parliament grew increasingly reluctant to grant taxes for a war that produced no victories, and the government was forced to resort to loans and other expedients to fund its operations. The wool trade, which had long been a major source of royal revenue, declined as continental markets were disrupted by the war. The economy, still recovering from the devastation of the Black Death, struggled under the burden of military expenditure. The Good Parliament of 1376 represented the culmination of parliamentary discontent with the direction of the reign. The Commons, meeting in the chapter house of Westminster Abbey, took the unprecedented step of impeaching royal ministers and demanding fundamental reforms in government. They accused William Latimer, the King's Chamberlain, of corruption and embezzlement. They attacked Alice Perrers for her influence over the King and her interference in legal proceedings. They demanded that the King govern with the advice of a council that would include representatives of the parliamentary community. The Speaker of this Parliament was Sir Peter de la Mare, a knight from Herefordshire, who articulated the Commons' grievances with unprecedented boldness. De la Mare was not intimidated by the power of those he accused, and he pressed the charges against Latimer and the others with skill and determination. His role established the office of Speaker of the House of Commons, which has continued to the present day. The Black Prince, though desperately ill, supported the Good Parliament's programme of reform. He saw in the parliamentary movement a chance to clean up the corruption that had infected his father's government and to ensure a stable transition of power to his young son Richard. The prince attended some of the parliamentary sessions, carried in on a litter because he was too weak to walk, and his presence lent weight and legitimacy to the Commons' demands. But the prince died before the Parliament concluded, and with his death, the reform movement lost its most powerful protector. John of Gaunt, who had been the target of much parliamentary criticism, moved quickly to reverse the Good Parliament's achievements. A new Parliament, summoned in early 1377, annulled the impeachments and restored those who had been removed from office. Alice Perrers returned to court, and the reformers were scattered and silenced. The reversal of the Good Parliament's reforms demonstrated the limits of parliamentary power in the 14th century. Without the support of a powerful patron like the Black Prince, the Commons could not sustain their challenge to the established order. John of Gaunt, with his vast wealth and his network of retainers, was simply too powerful to be opposed successfully. The final year of Edward's life was a melancholy time. The king was confined to his chambers at Sheen Palace, too weak to participate in government or even to appear in public. His mind wandered, and he was reportedly unable to recognise those around him. Alice Perrers remained at his side, and hostile chroniclers later claimed that she stripped the rings from his fingers as he lay dying, a story that may be exaggerated, but that reflects the low esteem in which she was held. Edward III died on June 21st, 1377, at Sheen Palace. He was 64 years old and had reigned for 50 years, longer than any English king before him. At the moment of his death, according to some accounts, he was attended only by a single priest, his family and courtiers having abandoned him. It was a sad end for a king who had once been the most celebrated monarch in Christendom. The king's body was brought to Westminster Abbey for burial, accompanied by a grand funeral procession that belied the loneliness of his final hours. He was interred beside Queen Philippa, as he had promised, in a tomb that he had commissioned years earlier. The bronze effigy that marks his grave shows him as he wished to be remembered, a vigorous king in the prime of life, not the broken old man he had become. Edward was succeeded by his grandson, Richard, the son of the Black Prince who became King Richard II at the age of 10. The new reign would be troubled from the start, as the young king struggled to assert his authority against powerful uncles and a restive nobility. The seeds of future conflict, planted during Edward's long reign, would eventually blossom into the dynastic wars that tore England apart in the following century. The transition of power was managed by John of Gaunt, who served as the dominant figure in the regency government that ruled during Richard's minority. Gaunt was careful to maintain the forms of legitimacy, ensuring that Richard was properly crowned and that the machinery of government continued to function. But real power lay with Gaunt and the other magnates, and the young king chafed under their control, just as his grandfather had chafed under the dominance of Mortimer half a century earlier. The legacy that Edward left to his successors was mixed. On the one hand, he had raised England to a position of unprecedented power and prestige, winning great victories in France and establishing English military supremacy for a generation. He had created institutions like the Order of the Garter that would endure for centuries. He had presided over a flourishing of English culture and a strengthening of English national identity. On the other hand, Edward left behind a kingdom burdened with debt, committed to a war it could not win, and divided by factional conflicts that would only grow more intense in the years to come. His generous provision for his younger sons had created a group of powerful magnates whose rivalries would destabilise English politics for generations. The unresolved question of the French succession would continue to poison Anglo-French relations and would eventually lead to renewed warfare. The judgment of history on Edward III has varied over the centuries. To his contemporaries and immediate successors, he was a great king, a worthy successor to the legendary Arthur, a model of chivalric virtue and military prowess. The chroniclers who wrote in the decades after his death celebrated his achievements and mourned his passing. Later generations have been more critical. Historians have pointed to the ultimate failure of his French ambitions, the social and economic disruptions caused by his wars, and the dynastic conflicts that his family arrangements helped to create. Some have seen him as a king who sacrificed the long-term interests of his kingdom for short-term military glory, a ruler whose achievements proved ephemeral while the costs endured. But perhaps the fairest assessment is that Edward was a man of his time, pursuing goals that his contemporaries understood and valued, using methods that were considered legitimate and even admirable. He was not a modern statesman, calculating costs and benefits with cold rationality. He was a medieval king, shaped by the values of chivalry and the expectations of his class. Judged by the standards of his own age, he was unquestionably a success, one of the greatest kings England had ever known. To understand the full significance of Edward III's reign, we must look beyond the battles and treaties, the triumphs and failures, to consider the broader changes that transformed English society during his 50 years on the throne. The England of 1377 was a very different place from the England of 1327, and many of these changes were directly or indirectly connected to the events of Edward's reign. The most dramatic change was demographic. The Black Death of 1348 and 1349, along with subsequent outbreaks of plague, had reduced the population of England by perhaps a third or even more. Villages that had been thriving communities in Edward's youth were abandoned or shrunken, their fields returning to forest and waste. The labour force that worked the land and produced the wealth of the kingdom had been decimated. This demographic catastrophe had profound economic consequences. The shortage of labour drove up wages despite the government's attempts to control them through legislation like the Statute of Labourers. Peasants who had been bound to the land by custom and law found that their services were now valuable, and they began to demand better terms from their landlords. The old manorial system, which had organised rural life for centuries, began to break down as lords found it impossible to maintain the traditional arrangements. The changes in the countryside were reflected in changes in the towns and cities. The urban population had also been devastated by plague, but the survivors often found themselves better off than before. Skilled craftsmen could command higher wages, and merchants who had survived the plague sometimes inherited the businesses of those who had died. A new class of prosperous townspeople began to emerge, people who were neither noble nor peasant, but who possessed wealth and influence in their own right. The House of Commons in particular grew in importance during Edward's reign. The knights and burgesses who represented the shires and towns in Parliament became increasingly assertive, demanding a voice in the great decisions of state and using their control over taxation to extract concessions from the Crown. The Good Parliament of 1376, with its impeachment of royal ministers and its demands for reform, demonstrated how far the Commons had come from their humble origins as mere petitioners for royal favour. The development of Parliament reflected broader changes in English political culture, the idea that the king should govern with the consent of his subjects, that taxation required parliamentary approval, and that the law bound the king as well as his subjects, became increasingly accepted during Edward's reign. These ideas would continue to evolve in the centuries to come, eventually forming the foundation of English constitutional governments. The English language itself underwent significant changes during Edward's reign. At the beginning of the 14th century, French was still the language of the court and the nobility. Latin was the language of the church and the law, and English was spoken mainly by the common people. But during Edward's reign, English began to reassert itself as the language of all classes. Several factors contributed to this linguistic shift. The long wars with France made the use of French seem unpatriotic, encouraging the nobility to adopt English as their primary language. The plague, by disrupting traditional patterns of education and social organisation, may have accelerated the decline of French among the upper classes, and the growth of English literature, culminating in the works of Geoffrey Chaucer at the end of the century, demonstrated that English was capable of expressing the highest thoughts and the most refined sentiments. Edward himself contributed to this linguistic shift by using English in some official contexts and by patronising English writers and poets. By the end of his reign, English had become the normal language of parliamentary proceedings and of many legal and administrative documents. The transformation was not complete, and French and Latin would continue to be used in certain contexts for centuries, but the direction of change was clear. The Church in England also underwent significant changes during Edward's reign. The papacy, which had dominated the Western Church for centuries, was weakened by the Babylonian captivity, the period from 1309 to 1377, when the popes resided at Avignon in France rather than at Rome. English suspicion of the Avignon papacy, which was seen as a tool of French policy, led to legislation restricting papal authority in England and asserting royal control over church appointments and revenues. The Statute of Provisors, first passed in 1351, attempted to limit the Pope's power to appoint clergy to English benefices. The Statute of Premunire, passed in 1353, prohibited appeals to papal courts in cases that belonged to the king's jurisdiction. These laws were not always strictly enforced, and the papacy retained considerable influence in English church affairs, but they established principles that would be invoked in later conflicts between Crown and Church. Religious life in England was also affected by the trauma of the Black Death. The plague killed clergy as well as lay people, and the Church struggled to replace the priests and monks who had died. The quality of clerical education and discipline may have declined as the Church scrambled to fill vacant positions. Some historians have seen in the post-plague period the beginnings of the religious dissatisfaction that would eventually lead to the Reformation. The military changes of Edward's reign were among the most significant and lasting. The English army that fought at Crécy and Poitiers was very different from the feudal hosts of earlier centuries. It was a professional force, recruited through contracts, and paid regular wages, organised into disciplined units, and equipped with the most effective weapons of the age. The longbow, which had proved so devastating against the French, became the characteristic weapon of English armies. The government encouraged archery practice among the common people, recognising that a large pool of trained archers was essential for military success. Laws were passed requiring men to practice with the bow on Sundays and holidays, and other sports and games were discouraged as distractions from this vital skill. The tactics developed during Edward's reign, combining dismounted men-at-arms with massed archers in defensive formations, would remain the basis of English military practice for over a century. English armies would continue to win victories using these methods until changes in technology and tactics finally rendered them obsolete. The social structure of England was also affected by the military changes of Edward's reign. The importance of the common archer in English armies gave ordinary men a stake in military success and a sense of their own value to the kingdom. The veterans who returned from the French wars brought with them experience of the wider world and expectations of better treatment at home. The traditional hierarchy, which placed nobles above commoners in all things, was subtly undermined by the demonstrated effectiveness of common soldiers in battle. As we come to the end of our exploration of Edward III's life and reign, it is worth pausing to reflect on what made this king so significant and why his story continues to fascinate us after more than 6 centuries. Edward ruled England for 50 years, from 1327 to 1377, one of the longest reigns in English history. During that half-century, he transformed his kingdom from a troubled and divided realm into the dominant military power in Western Europe. He won great victories that are still remembered and celebrated. He founded institutions that endure to the present day. He presided over a flowering of English culture and a strengthening of English national identity. But Edward's reign was also marked by failure and disappointment. The French territories he conquered were lost before his death. The plague devastated his kingdom and killed members of his own family. His final years were shadowed by military defeat, political conflict, and personal decline. The dynasty he founded would eventually tear itself apart in the Wars of the Roses, as his descendants fought for the throne he had occupied so gloriously. How should we assess such a reign? The answer depends partly on what we value and what standards we apply. If we judge Edward by the standards of his own time, by the values of chivalry and the expectations of medieval kingship, then he must be counted among the greatest of English kings. He was brave in battle, generous to his followers, magnificent in his court and successful in war. He embodied the ideals that his contemporaries admired, and they honoured him accordingly. If we apply more modern standards, the assessment becomes more complicated. Edward's wars, for all their glory, achieved little of lasting value. The territories he conquered were lost. The ransoms he collected were spent, and the thousands who died in his campaigns died for nothing permanent. The resources devoted to warfare might have been better used to improve the lives of his subjects, to build roads and bridges, to found schools and hospitals. But such judgments are perhaps unfair to a medieval king. Edward lived in a world where warfare was considered the highest calling of a nobleman, where military glory was the surest path to honour and renown. He pursued the goals that his society valued, using the methods that his society approved. To criticise him for not being a modern welfare state administrator is to miss the point entirely. What we can say with confidence is that Edward was a remarkably capable ruler who made the most of the opportunities that came his way. He seized power from Mortimer with boldness and skill. He rebuilt the prestige of the English monarchy after the disasters of his father's reign. He created an army that was the most effective fighting force in Europe. He managed the complex politics of his kingdom with considerable success, maintaining the support of his nobles and his parliament through decades of warfare and crisis. Edward was also fortunate in ways that contributed greatly to his success. He came to the throne at a time when England's enemies were weak and divided. He benefited from the development of the longbow, a weapon that gave English armies a decisive advantage on the battlefield. He was blessed with talented subordinates, men like the Black Prince and Henry of Grosmont, who won victories that reflected glory on their king. The personal qualities that Edward brought to his role were also significant. He was physically impressive, tall and handsome, with a natural dignity that commanded respect. He was brave in battle, leading his armies from the front and sharing the dangers faced by his men. He was generous to those who served him well, rewarding loyalty with lands and titles. He was also capable of cruelty and ruthlessness when he deemed it necessary, as the executions of Mortimer and others demonstrated. Edward's relationships with his family were generally harmonious, at least until the troubles of his final years. His marriage to Philippa was a genuine partnership, marked by affection and mutual respect. His sons, for all their later rivalries, served him loyally during his lifetime. The large family he raised was both a source of strength and a potential source of conflict, providing him with capable lieutenants, but also creating the conditions for future dynastic strife. The legacy of Edward III extends far beyond his own lifetime. The claim to the French throne that he asserted would be maintained by English kings for centuries, providing the justification for renewed warfare under Henry V and his successors. The Order of the Garter that he founded remains the most prestigious order of chivalry in England, its members still gathering at Windsor to honour their founder's memory. The parliamentary institutions that developed during his reign would continue to evolve, eventually becoming the foundation of English constitutional government. Edward's reign also left a lasting mark on English culture and identity. The victories at Crécy and Poitiers became part of the national mythology, stories told and retold to inspire later generations. The image of the English archer, the common man whose skill with the longbow could bring down the mightiest knight, became a powerful symbol of English military prowess. The sense of national pride that Edward's victories fostered would endure through centuries of subsequent history. But perhaps the most important aspect of Edward's legacy is simply the example he set of what a medieval king could achieve. He showed that a ruler who combined personal courage with political skill, who knew when to fight and when to negotiate, who rewarded loyalty and punished treachery, could accomplish great things. He demonstrated that England, despite its relatively small size and population, could compete with the greatest powers of Europe and emerge victorious. This example inspired later English kings, most notably Henry V, who consciously modelled himself on Edward and who achieved even greater victories in France before his early death. It also inspired the English people, giving them a sense of their own capabilities and their place in the world. The confidence that Edward's reign instilled would sustain England through many subsequent trials and challenges. Edward III died on June 21st, 1377, at Sheen Palace on the banks of the River Thames. He had reigned for 50 years, longer than any English king before him, and he had transformed his kingdom in ways that would resonate for centuries. The young man who had seized power from Roger Mortimer in a daring nighttime coup had become one of the most celebrated monarchs in European history. The king's death marked the end of an era. The generation that had fought at Crécy and Poitiers was passing away, taking with them the memories of those glorious days when English arms had seemed invincible. The troubles that had accumulated in Edward's final years would only grow worse under his young grandson Richard, leading eventually to revolution and the establishment of a new dynasty. But the legend of Edward III would endure long after the man himself had passed. In the centuries that followed, his reign would be remembered as a golden age, a time when England stood tall among the nations of Europe, and when the values of chivalry and martial honour reached their highest expression. Poets and chroniclers celebrated his achievements, holding him up as a model for future kings to emulate. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death was a period of uncertainty and transition. The young King Richard II, just 10 years old, was crowned at Westminster Abbey on July 16th, 1377, less than a month after his grandfather's passing. The ceremony was elaborate and magnificent, designed to inspire confidence in the new reign and to demonstrate the continuity of royal authority. But a child king could not rule in his own right, and power passed to a council of regency dominated by Richard's uncles and other great magnates. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was the most powerful figure in the kingdom, though he was careful not to claim the regency formally for himself. The tensions between the royal uncles, tensions that had been held in check during Edward's lifetime, now began to surface more openly. The new reign faced immediate challenges. The war with France continued to go badly, with English territories shrinking and English prestige declining. The financial burdens of the war fell heavily on the common people, who had already suffered greatly from the plague and its aftermath. Discontent simmered in the countryside and in the towns, waiting for an opportunity to express itself. That opportunity came in 1381, just 4 years after Edward's death, when the peasants' revolt erupted across southeastern England. The immediate cause was a poll tax imposed to fund the French war, but the underlying grievances went much deeper. The peasants who marched on London were protesting against the entire system of lordship and servitude that had governed English rural life for centuries. The revolt was eventually suppressed, and its leaders were executed, but it demonstrated how much had changed since the confident days of Edward's prime. The old certainties were crumbling, the old hierarchies were being questioned, and the old methods of governance were proving inadequate to the challenges of a transformed society. Edward's England was giving way to something new and uncertain. Richard II's reign would prove to be one of the most turbulent in English history. The young king grew into a man of refined tastes and autocratic temperament, determined to rule without the constraints that his grandfather had accepted. He quarrelled with his nobles, alienated his parliament, and eventually provoked a revolution that cost him his throne and his life. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, returned from exile and raised a rebellion against Richard. The king, who had made too many enemies and had too few friends, found himself abandoned and was forced to abdicate. Henry claimed the throne as King Henry IV, establishing the Lancastrian dynasty that would rule England for the next 60 years. The deposition of Richard II was a direct consequence of the arrangements that Edward III had made for his sons. By creating powerful dukedoms for his younger children, Edward had established a group of magnates whose wealth and influence rivaled that of the crown itself. When the legitimate line of succession faltered, these cadet branches were ready to contest for power. The Lancastrian kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, all traced their claim to the throne through John of Gaunt, Edward's third surviving son. But the descendants of Edward's fourth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, never forgot their own royal blood. In the mid-15th century, the Yorkist claim would be revived, leading to the Wars of the Roses that devastated England for a generation. These dynastic conflicts were Edward's most problematic legacy. His large family, which had seemed such a blessing during his lifetime, became a curse for his descendants. The multiple lines of royal descent created competing claims to the throne, and the vast estates that Edward had granted to his sons provided the resources for civil war. But this dark legacy should not overshadow the genuine achievements of Edward's reign. The king who died at Sheen in 1377 had accomplished more than almost any of his predecessors. He had restored the prestige of the English monarchy after the disasters of his father's reign. He had won great victories that established English military supremacy for a generation. He had created institutions and traditions that would endure for centuries. The Order of the Garter, which Edward founded in 1348, remains to this day the most prestigious order of chivalry in England. The chapel of St. George at Windsor, which he rebuilt and enlarged, still serves as the spiritual home of the order, and the Garter Knights still gather there each year to honour their founder's memory. The blue and gold robes, the motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, the elaborate ceremonies and rituals, all continue much as Edward established them more than 600 years ago. Parliament, which developed so significantly during Edward's reign, would continue to grow in power and importance in the centuries that followed. The principles established during Edward's time, that taxation required parliamentary consent, that the Commons had a right to be heard on matters of state, that even the king was bound by the law, would eventually form the foundation of English constitutional government. The Good Parliament of 1376, with its impeachment of royal ministers and its demands for reform, established precedents that would be invoked in later struggles between Crown and Parliament. The military innovations of Edward's reign also had lasting significance. The combination of longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms fighting from carefully chosen defensive positions would remain the basis of English tactical doctrine for over a century. Henry V would use these same methods to win his famous victory at Agincourt in 1415, and English armies would continue to rely on the longbow until changes in technology finally rendered it obsolete. The cultural achievements of Edward's reign, though less dramatic than the military victories, were equally important. The king's patronage of artists, writers, and musicians helped to create a court culture of remarkable sophistication. The use of English in official contexts, which Edward encouraged, contributed to the eventual triumph of the English language over French as the tongue of the educated classes. The sense of national identity that Edward's victories fostered would continue to develop in the centuries that followed. Edward's personal reputation remained high for generations after his death. The chroniclers who wrote in the late 14th and 15th centuries consistently portrayed him as one of the greatest of English kings, a worthy successor to the legendary Arthur. His military achievements were celebrated in song and story, and his court was remembered as a model of chivalric splendour. Jean Froissart, the great chronicler of the 100 Years' War, devoted much of his work to celebrating Edward's deeds and those of his knights. Froissart had known the English court personally having served in the household of Queen Philippa, and his accounts combine eyewitness observation with romantic enthusiasm. His chronicles became one of the most popular works of medieval literature, read and admired throughout Europe, and they did much to establish Edward's reputation for posterity. Later, historians have offered more nuanced assessments. Some have criticised Edward for pursuing military glory at the expense of his kingdom's long-term interests, for wasting resources on wars that achieved nothing permanent, for creating the dynastic tensions that would eventually tear England apart. Others have defended him as a man of his time, pursuing goals that his contemporaries valued and using methods that his society approved. The truth, as so often, lies somewhere in between. Edward was neither the perfect king of chivalric legend nor the reckless warmonger of revisionist criticism. He was a complex man living in complex times, doing his best to navigate the challenges he faced and to achieve the goals he set for himself. He succeeded more often than he failed, and his successes were spectacular enough to earn him a place among the greatest of English kings. The physical remains of Edward's reign can still be seen in England today. Windsor Castle, which he rebuilt and expanded, remains a royal residence, its great round tower dominating the skyline just as it did in Edward's day. The chapel of St. George, with its magnificent fan vaulting and its stalls for the Garter knights, stands as a testament to Edward's piety and his love of chivalric ceremony. Westminster Abbey, where Edward was crowned and where he lies buried beside his beloved Philippa, preserves the memory of his reign in stone and bronze. The tomb of Edward III in Westminster Abbey is one of the finest royal monuments in England. The bronze effigy shows the king as he wished to be remembered, bearded and majestic, wearing his crown and holding the symbols of royal authority. Around the base of the tomb are small figures representing his children, a reminder of the large family that was both his greatest blessing and his most problematic legacy. Visitors to the abbey can still see this tomb today, can stand where Edward stood when he was crowned more than 6 centuries ago, can walk the same stones that he walked during his long reign. The connection to the past is tangible and immediate, a reminder that history is not just an abstract collection of dates and events, but the story of real people who lived and loved and struggled and died. The story of Edward III is, in the end, a very human story. It is the story of a boy who grew up in the shadow of his parents' troubled marriage and his father's disastrous reign. It is the story of a young man who seized power with boldness and skill and who proved himself on the battlefields of Scotland and France. It is the story of a husband and father who loved his wife and children and who built a family that would shape English history for generations. It is also the story of an aging king who watched his life's work crumble, who buried his beloved wife and his heroic son, who saw his kingdom torn by faction and his treasury depleted by unsuccessful wars. The contrast between the glorious middle years and the sad decline is one of the most poignant aspects of Edward's story, a reminder that even the greatest triumphs are temporary and that all human achievements are subject to the ravages of time. But if Edward's story teaches us about the transience of earthly glory, it also teaches us about the enduring power of human achievement. The institutions he created, the precedents he established, the traditions he founded, all continue to shape English life more than 6 centuries after his death. The memory of his reign, preserved in chronicles and histories, in monuments and ceremonies, remains a living part of English national identity. Edward III was not a perfect king. He made mistakes, he suffered failures, and he left problems for his successors to solve. But he was a great king nonetheless, a man who rose to the challenges of his time and who left his kingdom stronger and more confident than he found it. His reign was a turning point in English history, a moment when the possibilities of the future seemed unlimited and when England first began to see itself as a major European power. The England that Edward left behind in 1377 was a very different place from the England he had inherited 50 years earlier. It was a kingdom that had been tested by war and plague, by political conflict and social upheaval, and that had emerged from these trials with a stronger sense of its own identity and capabilities. The challenges that lay ahead were formidable, but so were the resources that Edward's reign had created. As we conclude our journey through the life and times of Edward III, we are left with a sense of wonder at the richness and complexity of medieval history. This was an age of great contrasts, of magnificent achievements and terrible sufferings, of noble ideals and brutal realities. Edward's story encompasses all of these elements, reflecting the full range of human experience in a time very different from our own, yet connected to us by the unbroken thread of history. The king who was born at Windsor Castle in 1312, who seized power at Nottingham in 1330, who triumphed at Crécy and Calais, who mourned his wife and son, who died alone and forgotten at Sheen, was a man like any other, subject to the same hopes and fears, the same joys and sorrows that we all experience. His story speaks to us across the centuries because it is, at its heart, a human story, the story of one man's struggle to make his mark on the world and to leave something lasting behind. And in that struggle, Edward III succeeded beyond what most of us could ever hope to achieve. His name is still remembered, his deeds are still celebrated, and his legacy still shapes the world we live in today. That is perhaps the greatest tribute that can be paid to any king or to any human being. To be remembered, to be honoured, to have made a difference that endures long after we ourselves have passed from the scene.